I think the task of identifying, disrupting and preventing child sexual exploitation lies right at the epicenter of intelligence-led safeguarding. Child sexual abuse and CSE are complex, hugely underreported, and still often misunderstood. And fitting the pieces of the jigsaw together to see the bigger picture and the bigger challenge is of central importance. So, the sexual abuse of children, some brief contextual comments. I think it's really important to remember that child sexual exploitation, of which we've heard a lot about in the last 2 or 3 years, is part of a bigger problem of child sexual abuse. And I think it can most accurately and most helpfully be seen as a subset of a bigger problem of child sexual abuse. There are huge long-term effects on the victims of CSE and CSA, physical, psychological, and economic. The majority of sexual abuse and exploitation goes unreported and undetected. And I think it's helpful just to remember David Finkelhall's work dating back to the 1980s, really, in terms of his preconditions, which help to describe what needs to be in place for sexual abuse to take place. Firstly, there needs to be the motivation. There needs to be someone who wants to perpetrate the abuse. That person or those people need to overcome internal inhibitions. They need to overcome external inhibitions, and finally they need to overcome the child's resistance before the abuse is perpetrated. I think that work by David Finkelhall has been very influential really in helping to shape therapeutic work for victims, help us to understand offender behaviour, how to best disrupt it, and help also to shape prevention activity as well. The impacts of child sexual abuse can be summarised in a number of key ways, and most in particular that it can leave victims experiencing a very keen sense of betrayal, of powerlessness, stigmatisation, what's termed traumatic sexualisation, so often early sexualisation, inappropriate sexualisation of children and young people as a result of the abuse. And of course, as we're aware, addiction, depression, self-harm, and of course, ultimately suicide on occasions. And of course, we've heard today from the release of the NSPCC report with interviews with some of Savills victims as to how difficult they found it was to talk about what had happened for fear that they would never be believed. Just a few brief comments about kind of context and external environment as far as CSA and CSE are concerned. I think it's right to say over the last 2 decades we've seen a significant growth in understanding in relation to research evidence, in relation to a lot of aspects of CSA and CSE. However, policy, practice and service delivery has been relatively unstrategic and quite issue-led. Some encouraging signs to the contrary of late, of which I'll come to later, but development has been broadly uneven, and there's still a lot we don't know about prevalence, impact, and efficacy of intervention as well. And importantly, in relation to prevention activity, there's still a lot we don't know as to whether it works or not. Until about mid-2010, until the elections, we were working within a relatively rich policy and legislative period, less so now. Devolution continues to have a big impact, I think, really, in terms of a diversion and move away from kind of uniform practice across the UK as far as work in relation to CSE and CSE is concerned. And that's brought some huge benefits as well, really, in terms of some really innovative practice in some of the devolved nations. The communications revolution, of course, has had a huge impact and continues to have a huge impact and will do in relation to drivers of CSA and CSE, and particularly in relation to, of course, online abuse. That, in turn, has informed and fed into the commercialisation and sexualisation of children. We've heard quite a bit about that over the last couple of years, and, of course, the report produced by Reg Bailey. Encouragingly, we've now seen the development of the Home Office National Group on the sexual abuse of children and vulnerable adults, and that national group was formed in response to the Savile case, the murders of April Jones and Tia Sharp, amongst other things, and of course some quite high-profile CSE cases in Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford and elsewhere. So that national group has been brought together to begin to take a much more strategic look at the drivers of CSA and CSE and what we need to do to prevent it.